Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get smart about important stuff fast. We dig into the best sources, pull out the key ideas, and basically give you that shortcut to really understanding things.
And today, we're diving into a book that honestly shifts how you think about something huge. It's Johann Hari's Lost Connections, Why You're Depressed and How to Find Hope.
It really does. And what makes it so powerful isn't just the research, though there's loads of that. It's Hari's own story. This isn't some academic exercise for him.
Not at all. He lived it. Severe depression, anxiety. He talks about these long crying jags. Times he literally had to just, shut himself away and cry. It sounds incredibly raw.
Yeah, and that constant anxious monologue he mentions, just humming away in the background even when he wasn't crying. That personal struggle is really the engine behind the whole book, isn't it?
Absolutely. It drove him to find answers.
Yeah.
And like so many people, especially back then, he initially bought into the standard story.
Right. He got diagnosed in the late 90s, and the explanation was, well, it was simple. Depleted serotonin, a brain disease.
Exactly. They showed him diagrams, of this malfunctioning brain and told him these new drugs, SSRIs like Surexat or Paxil in the U.S., could fix it.
And he says he was already sold on it. It was the dominant narrative, the one everyone seemed to accept. He didn't question it for years.
Who would? It sounded scientific, straightforward. A chemical problem needs a chemical solution.
But that's the massive question the book throws up, the one we're really going to wrestle with today. What if that story, the one Hari and millions of others were told, what if it was wrong?
Or at least, seriously incomplete.
Exactly. And that's our mission here. We're not just going to skim the surface, list symptoms. We want to get into the context, the surprising research, the, frankly, unexpected solutions Hari found.
We're aiming for those aha moments, basically, helping you understand what might really be going on.
Giving you that shortcut to being properly informed on something that affects, well, almost everyone in some way. So let's start unpacking it. Where did Hari's own questioning begin?
It seems to have really hit him in his early 30s. He calls it a negative epiphany. He realized that even though he kept upping his antidepressant dose, the sadness just kept coming back.
He describes that feeling like a temporary bubble of apparently chemical relief, but then the prickling unhappiness would just seep back in.
Yeah, and those awful recurring thoughts. Life is pointless. Everything you're doing is pointless. It sounds absolutely draining.
And he admits it was a real fight to let go of that broken brain idea. It had become part of his identity, his explanation for his suffering.
That disillusionment, that painful moment, was actually the key, wasn't it? It pushed him to look beyond the accepted story and see what the science actually said.
And what he found was, well, pretty explosive.
Definitely. He talks to Professor David Healy, a major figure, one of the first scientists in Britain to really study these new antidepressants.
And Healy does not mince words, does he?
Not at all. He says flat out about the serotonin theory, the chemical imbalance idea. Yeah. There was never any basis for it, ever. It was just marketing copy.
Wow. Marketing copy. That's a heavy statement considering how widespread that idea became.
It really is. Healy insists that back in the early 90s, no sort of, serious expert actually believed people were depressed because of low serotonin.
So the theory didn't ever get credited properly because the evidence just wasn't there.
Pretty much. Healy points out that the biggest study looking directly at serotonin's effect on mood found no direct relationship with depression. It suggests we were maybe barking up the wrong tree entirely.
And it wasn't just Healy saying this, right? Other experts chimed in.
Oh, yeah. Here he quotes Professor Andrew Scull from Princeton, who calls the low serotonin explanation deeply misleading and unscientific.
On words.
And then there's Dr. Lucy Johnstone, a clinical psychologist. She was even more direct with Hari.
What did she say?
She basically told him, almost everything you were told was bullshit. The serotonin theory is a lie. Just incredibly blunt about the lack of solid evidence.
You can imagine how jarring that must have been for Hari. And for anyone who's been told that story for years, he talks about feeling this wild implausibility.
Like, how could something so huge, taken by so many people, get through all the supposed scientific checks and balances if it was fundamentally flawed?
He uses that analogy, right? Like landing after a flight and finding out the plane had been flown by a monkey the whole way. You just assume there are safeguards.
It really shakes your faith in the system, I suppose. And it leads straight into the next big question. Okay, if the theory is shaky, what about the drugs themselves? Do they actually work?
And this is where Irving Kirsch's research comes in, which Hari discusses quite a bit.
Right. Kirsch's work consistently showed that antidepressants have Only a really small effect over and above placebo. A small effect, but still only slightly better than a sugar pill, essentially.
That's challenging stuff. And Hari includes that fascinating historical story to illustrate the power of belief, the placebo effect.
You mean Elisha Perkins and the Perkins tractors?
Exactly. Back in 1799, these metal wands that supposedly healed people.
Until another doctor made fake ones out of wood
Right.
and used them on patients with chronic pain.
And the results were incredible. 4 out of 5 patients felt immediately, and 3 remarkably relieved. One guy with terrible knee pain could suddenly walk fine, just from a wooden stick they believed was special.
It's a stunning example of how powerful the mind is. And Kirsch argues, and Hari reports, that this placebo power accounts for a huge chunk of the perceived benefit from antidepressants.
What's really disturbing, though, is that Hari points out the drug company's own data, the stuff they submitted to the FDA, actually confirmed this relatively small effect size over placebo.
Yeah, and he mentions a really specific personal example with Paxil, the drug he was on. The company apparently admitted privately it probably wouldn't work well for people like him, and they ended up paying a big settlement over how they marketed it.
It's important to add the nuance Hari includes, though. Some scientists disagree with Kirsch on the exact numbers and comparisons.
True, but the general idea that the effect beyond placebo is pretty small. That seems widely accepted now.
Okay, so if the chemical imbalance theory is largely debunked, and the drugs have a limited effect, then what are the real drivers of depression and anxiety?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where Hari really pivots the whole conversation. He shifts the focus away from just the brain and isolation.
And looks at the context of our lives.
Exactly. He introduces Joanne Cashador's work on grief. She points out this big cultural mistake we make. We see distress, we look at a checklist of symptoms, and if they match, we call it a brain disease, often without really considering what's happening in the person's life.
She uses that incredibly vivid metaphor, doesn't she? Treating depression chemically without addressing the cause is like putting a Band-Aid on an amputated limb.
It's powerful. Her point is, the symptoms aren't the disease, they're messengers. They're telling us something is deeply wrong, and we need to find the deeper problem, not just silence the message.
And he highlights the paradox. Grief and depression can look identical symptom-wise, but we accept grief as a response to loss, something external.
Yet similar distress, if it doesn't have an obvious trial like bereavement, gets labeled an internal malfunction.
Which leads Hari to pose this absolutely central question for the book. What if depression is, in fact, a form of grief for our own lives not being as they should?
What if it is a form of grief for the connections we have lost, yet still need? That question just reframes everything. It pushes us to look outwards.
Okay, so let's get into those lost connections. What's the first major cause Hari identifies?
The first one he really digs into is disconnection from meaningful work. And he starts with a story, a guy named Joe Phillips, working in a paint shop.
Oh yeah, that description of his job is just soul-crushing. Put a dash of pigment, shake it vigorously, take your money, over and over.
Joe talks about feeling completely voiceless, unheard, just deadened by the repetition and lack of autonomy.
And how that feeling spilled over into his home life, right? He couldn't just switch off the numbness after work.
Exactly. He'd just collapse, watch TV, drink. It was hard to be present for his family after being switched off all day.
And this personal story really sets up the bigger picture, leading into Michael Marmot's Whitehall studies.
Which are so important here.
Yeah.
Marmot studied British civil servants, people with stable, decent desk jobs, not people in poverty.
But his findings were staggering. Even in that environment, people in lower grade positions had a much higher risk of depression and even death.
It flew in the face of what people thought. He pinpointed 2 key things. First, a lack of control. He said, where you feel worst about jobs is when you feel out of control.
Makes sense. Feeling like a cog in a machine.
And the second was a mismatch between efforts and rewards. If you work hard, maybe do an unpleasant task, and it's never acknowledged or rewarded, the message you get is you're irrelevant.
So the implication is huge. It's not just about poverty wages. The very nature of work, the lack of control and recognition can be toxic. It can literally generate despair.
Right. It suggests that a lot of modern work environments might be fundamentally unhealthy for us psychologically. It's not necessarily about individual weakness. It could be the system itself.
So disconnection from meaningful work is number one. What's the next major disconnection Hari explores?
This one feels almost obvious in a way. It's disconnection from other people. Loneliness.
He talks about his own parents moving to that London suburb, Edgware.
Yeah, describing it as full of decent, likable, alienated people hurrying through. He felt that lack of real community connection himself.
And this personal feeling connects directly to the science, particularly John Cacioppo's work on loneliness.
Cacioppo was fighting against the tide initially, wasn't he? The scientific community was skeptical about studying these softer factors outside the brain.
But his research was rigorous, and the findings were stark. Loneliness isn't just sad, it's deadly. He found it has the same effect on your health as being obese.
That's incredible. Isolated people in his studies were 2 to 3 times more likely to die over a 9-year period.
And he explains this from an evolutionary standpoint, right? We evolved in cooperative tribes. Nature is connection for humans. We are fundamentally wired to belong.
Absolutely. And Hari uses the example of the Hutterites to show this isn't just theory.
Right, the communal group in North America, Cacioppo's team studied them.
And found the lowest level of loneliness that I'd seen anywhere in the world, which powerfully suggests loneliness isn't inevitable. It's a product of the way we live now.
And sadly, the trends Hari cites paint a bleak picture of the way we live now.
Yeah, that statistic is shocking. More Americans who have no close friends than any other option. More people have 0 close friends than have 1 or 2 or 3.
And the decline in family time, fewer shared meals, less time together, it all adds up.
Plus that awful snowball effect, where people who are depressed or anxious often get less support, which makes them withdraw even more. It's a vicious cycle.
What about technology's role in this? Smartphones, social media, are they the cause?
Hari's take is nuanced. He visited an internet rehab center and started thinking, is technology the root cause, or is it more of a symptom, a way we cope with underlying disconnection?
So maybe we reach for our phones because the real-world connections aren't there.
That seems to be his conclusion, that the tech might amplify it or be a temporary fix. But the deeper issue is that, as he puts it, we have become the first humans to ever dismantle our tribes. We've lost that fundamental structure.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. Okay, so disconnection from work, disconnection from people. What's the third one?
This one's about values, disconnection from meaningful values. He kicks it off with a personal bit about his own weight gain, antidepressants, and eating a lot of fried chicken.
And he uses that to pivot to the idea of junk food and, more broadly, junk values. The things society tells us will make us happy, but often leave us empty.
Exactly. And this is where psychologist Tim Kasser's research is absolutely central. Kasser was interested in this very question. Does chasing extrinsic goals, money, status, nice stuff, actually lead to happiness?
Compared to intrinsic goals like community, relationships, personal growth, making a difference.
Right. And Kasser's findings were pretty countercultural, to say the least.
Yeah.
He found consistently that achieving those extrinsic goals gave people no boost in their actual day-to-day happiness.
None. So the promotion, the fancy car, the new gadget, they don't actually move the needle on happiness.
Apparently not, according to Kasser's research. Which is wild because, as Hari says, our whole culture is set up to get us to think this way.
It's the air we breathe, almost. But Kasser backed it up with data.
Oh, yeah. 22 separate studies showed more materialism equals more depression. 12 studies linked it to more anxiety. And this wasn't just like a Western thing. It held up across different cultures.
He uses that pie metaphor, which is really helpful.
Yeah, our values are like slices of a pie. If you pour all your energy, your time, your focus into the money slice or the status slice.
Then the slices for relationships, meaning contributing to others, they just have to get smaller. You only have so much pie.
Exactly. And Hari points a finger squarely at advertising for constantly pushing these junk values.
Suggesting an ad saying, "You're fine as you are, you have enough stuff," would be the worst ad in human history for the industry.
It highlights the conflict, doesn't it? And he argues there's an inherent anxiety in chasing external validation, always wondering, are they going to reward me? Do they like me or just my stuff? It leads to feeling hollow.
And these deeper intrinsic values connection, meaning they're described as more fragile, right? Easier to get distracted from.
Yeah, they need conscious effort. He gives that example of the couple in Edgeware, working jobs, they hate to buy things they think will make them happy, but just feeling stuck and dissatisfied.
Trapped in the cycle. So what's the takeaway here? What does Kasser suggest?
It's about consciously choosing to pull yourself out of the materialistic environments as much as possible and actively replace them with things that feed those deeper intrinsic needs, making deliberate choices about where you put your energy.
Okay, those 3 disconnections work, people. Values are huge. But Hari doesn't stop there, does he? He goes deeper into trauma.
Right, and this section starts with the really fascinating work of Dr. Vincent Flitti, who was initially studying obesity.
And he was completely baffled because some patients who lost a lot of weight through surgery actually became more depressed, even suicidal.
It makes no sense on the surface, does it? They achieve this goal, supposed to make them happier, and they get worse.
But Felitti did something crucial. He stopped just telling them what to do, and he started really listening.
And he discovered that for many, their weight had been a form of protection, a shield. He shares that heartbreaking quote from a woman who'd survived abuse. "Overweight is overlooked, and that's the way I need to be." The weight felt like safety.
That insight was massive. It led him to co-found the ACE study Adverse Childhood Experiences.
A landmark study. It looked at the link between childhood trauma, things like abuse, neglect, violence in the home, and health problems in adulthood.
And the connections they found between trauma and depression were, well, they were off the charts.
Unbelievably strong. Experiencing 6 or more types of trauma meant you were 5 times more likely to be depressed as an adult, 7 or more. The risk jumped by 3,100%.
3,000%. And it wasn't just the obvious physical or sexual abuse. Emotional abuse on its own was a powerful predictor.
It really challenged the purely biological model. Felitti's takeaway was, there's a house fire inside many of us, and we've been concentrating on the smoke.
Seeing depression not as the primary disease, but as a normal response to abnormal life experiences. A signal of that fire.
Hari admits this idea initially angered him. It threatened that broken brain story that had, in a weird way, protected him. It meant facing painful stuff.
But it also pointed to something incredibly hopeful, the power of simply acknowledging the trauma.
Yeah, the study found that when a doctor just listened compassionately, acknowledged the patient's past trauma, those patients needed 35% less follow-up medical care. Just being heard, being validated.
That woman's simple note, "Thank you for asking," after sharing her story for the first time. It says everything.
It really does. And understanding this deep link to trauma provides a bridge to the second half of the book, which is all about the solutions, the reconnections.
Right, moving from the problems to the pathways back. What's the first reconnection he focuses on?
Reconnecting to other people, but often in a collective way, not just one-on-one. He uses the Coty & Co. protest in Berlin as a prime example.
This was residents in a working-class area fighting huge rent increases, right?
Exactly. And he tells these individual stories. Nurai, who was suicidal, Tunkai, who'd been homeless, Mehmet, wary of joining forces with different groups. Their problems weren't solved by pills.
They were solved by community, by collective action.
Precisely. By other people standing by their side, committed to walking on the path with them, finding collective solutions. They found belonging and purpose in the shared struggle.
It represents that shift he talks about from the individualistic vision, solve your own problems, buy more stuff, to a collectivist vision.
Yeah, understanding that we're a group, we belong together, we are connected. Supported by research showing that the more you see happiness as social, the better off you tend to be.
And he contrasts this with the Amish community again, doesn't he?
As another example, yes. Their conscious choice to slow down, prioritize community and presence over frantic individualism. Their low loneliness rates show it's possible to live differently.
So reconnecting with others is key. What about reconnecting to meaningful work? How do we fix the issues raised earlier?
He offers the example of Baltimore Bicycle Works. It's a worker-owned cooperative.
Meaning the employees have real control, a real say in how things are run.
Exactly. And Hari found that even though the actual tasks might be similar to other bike shops, the workers there were dramatically happier, less anxious, and less depressed.
Because they had autonomy. They had a voice.
That seems to be the core of it. As one worker put it, in most jobs, you don't control your economic life. You don't have free speech. Depression and anxiety in that context start to look like rational reactions to the situation.
It taps into that fundamental human need Hari mentions. People want to work. Everybody wants to feel useful and have purpose. Co-ops seem to mirror those ancestral participative tribes more closely.
It's a structural solution, not just an individual one.
Okay, and then reconnecting to meaningful values. How do we combat that tide of materialism?
Here he brings in Nathaniel Branden's therapy work with people addicted to shopping.
Asking those two simple questions. What do you spend your money on? And what do you really value?
And the disconnect was often huge. People pouring money into things that had zero connection to their actual core values. Love, truth, family, whatever it was.
It just highlights again how those 5,000 daily ads push us towards consumption as the answer, overriding our deeper needs.
Which suggests we need more than just individual willpower. Hari mentions Sao Paulo banning billboards as a societal approach.
Trying to change the environment, reduce the constant pressure to consume, rather than just telling individuals to resist harder, a collective shift.
It's a really interesting idea. Then he moves into another type of reconnection, which is maybe less intuitive at first.
Which one is that?
It's about sympathetic joy and sort of overcoming an addiction to the self.
Yeah.
He tells the story of his friend Rachel Schubert.
Who realized she'd spent her whole life chasing her own happiness and just ended up exhausted by it.
Right. And she discovered, through meditation, specifically sympathetic joy practice, that there's this always supply of happiness available just by genuinely delighting in other people's happiness. Vicarious joy.
Finding joy in others' good fortune instead of maybe feeling envious or focusing only on your own lack.
Exactly. It shifts the focus outward. And practices like loving-kindness meditation, which fosters this, have actually been shown to increase helpfulness and be particularly beneficial for people with trauma backgrounds.
That's fascinating. And this is where he brings in the perhaps more controversial topic of psychedelics.
Yes, specifically Roland Griffiths' research with psilocybin at Johns Hopkins. He gives the historical context, promising research in the 50s and 60s that got shut down.
And Griffiths' team revisited it carefully, therapeutically. He tells the story of Mark.
Yeah, Mark, the financial consultant, depressed, hadn't responded to Paxil. He had a psilocybin session in this controlled, safe setting.
And Hari explains psilocybin isn't about random hallucinations, it's mind manifesting. It brings up your own subconscious stuff.
Right. For Mark, it brought up deep grief related to his father's death years earlier, stuff he hadn't processed. It helped break down those emotional walls.
And the common theme after these sessions seems to be this profound sense of connection to others, nature, meaning.
The very opposite of those junk values. Hari calls it a potential crash course in the kind of shifts meditation might bring more slowly.
But he includes important warnings, right?
Absolutely crucial. Bad trips are possible. It must be done in a safe, supportive context. It's not about destroying the ego, but finding a healthy relationship with it. And the insights only stick if you act on them afterwards.
Integration is key. Okay, so we've covered reconnecting to people, work, values, even exploring sympathetic joy and psychedelics. What's the final piece?
The final reconnection broadens out again, looking at creating real security and enabling wider social change. He discusses universal basic income, or UBI.
Through Evelyn Forget's research on that Canadian experiment, Mincome, from the 70s.
Yes, in Dauphin, Manitoba, everyone got a basic income floor, and the results were striking.
Kids stayed in school longer, fewer low birth weight babies, parents spent more time with kids, overall work hours barely dropped.
Forget argued this showed depression isn't just a brain issue. If it were, giving people money wouldn't have significantly reduced distress levels. It pointed directly to economic insecurity as a massive factor.
Which ties into what Rutger Bregman argues: we tend to blame a collective problem on the individual. We need system change, not just individual fixes.
But how do we achieve big system change? It often feels impossible.
And Hari uses Andrew Solomon's fight for gay marriage as an example here.
An idea that seemed crazy preposterous initially, but collective action made it happen. Hari reminds us we all benefit from past social changes that seemed impossible at first. Women's rights, the weekend.
Things we take for granted now were once radical ideas.
Exactly. And Hari ties this back personally. Acknowledging his own privilege allowed him the space and resources to make changes in his life. Not everyone has that luxury.
Which leads to his powerful concluding argument. If the problem doesn't originate with them alone, it can't be solved by them alone.
We have to band together, he says, to fundamentally change our environment, tackle the root causes of depression and anxiety in our culture.
So bringing it all together, what's the ultimate message of Lost Connections?
I think the core shift is seeing depression not as a malfunction, but as a signal, a vital, necessary signal.
The pain isn't the enemy, it's an ally, pointing you away from a life that isn't working towards something more fulfilling.
You have a choice. Numb the signal, maybe waste years doing that, or listen to it. Let it guide you towards meeting your real, deep human needs for connection, meaning, value, security.
And understanding it this way fosters empathy, right? Because if it's largely a response to how we live, it could happen to any of us.
Precisely. He argues the individual blame narrative serves certain interests, like the massive antidepressant market,
right,
but it ignores the bigger picture of disconnection and loss of meaning.
So the hope lies in understanding these 9 disconnections and actively working towards the 9 reconnections, both individually and crucially, collectively.
He believes that deep down, the hunger for this change is out there all around you, waiting just beneath the surface. People are craving these connections.
It's a hopeful message, ultimately, despite the difficult truths. So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. What signals might your own life or the lives around you be sending?
And instead of seeing distress purely as an individual problem to be managed, could you think about collective steps, actions within your community, your workplace, that could foster more connection, more meaning, more security?
How can we, as Hari urges, start to band together to reshape our environment into one where it's easier for everyone to thrive, something to really mull over?